What was it particularly about early music and baroque violin that you loved most, and why did you choose to specialize in that compared to, say, the modern violin?
Because there's a sort of an honesty in baroque music. There's a purity in it. It's so close to the voice that the phrasing all made sense as soon as I started to study it from a baroque point of view, historical performance. It made more sense. It was so much more natural, I think. And then playing with the baroque bow was just a joy. It was just like everything fell into place with that as well. I quite liked the although I sometimes struggle with gut strings because they can be so difficult and temperamental. But I did love that kind of rawness in the sound. That kind of again, it's that purity and honesty really appealed to me. And also, it's going back to times that were simpler, where there's no technology then. It was all just kind of candlelight and real. Everything was felt more real, really. And it really, the whole thing appealed to me so much. And
Yeah.
it still does. It really does. It's not without its difficulties. And sometimes when I play my modern violin, I just think, oh, it's so much easier, modern strings and a chin rest and all the rest of it. But then I soon miss the baroque, and I miss the challenges. And the other thing about baroque is that you can be very creative in it. The less there is on the page, the more you can do things with the music, with ornamentation and with your dynamic range and your articulation. And I've always loved that you've got that freedom to be creative yourself.
Do you think that people, though, might be a bit scared about playing baroque music because of all the so-called rules that are in place?
It's funny. It's a very good question because yes, there are a lot of rules, and you do have to know the rules before you can, if you like, break them.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of studying to be done, and there still always will be. For me, I'll never have finished reading up about things. In workshops that I teach, people ask me questions, and I think, oh, that's an interesting one, and I don't know that. That's something for me to look up this week or whatever. So it will always be like that. And yes, it's scary because you can't hide behind anything with baroque violin. The tuning is got to be so precise. You can't hide behind a wide vibrato, for example. But the funny thing is that when people do get into baroque, then they realize how freeing it is as well. Yes, there are all these rules, but there's also this wonderful sense of the mavericks, the maverick composers of the time, and the fact that there were such flamboyant performers. They, in a way, it's more free, but you do have to know the rules. You can't just think, oh yes, it's baroque music, so that means no vibrato, everything plays very fast, and
Just do whatever you like.
there's been
Yeah.
some terrible kind of assumptions over the years with people that haven't really studied it, and actually it's far more nuanced than that, far more nuanced.
What was it like to be right there in the throes of I suppose, the so-called authentic movement, the historical performance movement? I imagine you were there right from the beginning. I mean, we'd had Liz Walker on a few years ago, and she said that it was an incredible time, which I think we kind of take for granted.
It was an incredible time. I'd just like to say I wasn't there quite at the very beginning.
Oh,
The real
okay.
beginning started in about the 1920s, actually.
Exactly.
And then there was the real explosion of it that happened in the 70s.
Yes,
And it
absolutely.
was really the late 80s that I started, and early 90s that I got involved. And that turned out to be such an amazing era because it was the era of all the recordings that were being made as well. So endless recordings, endless tours, and endless concerts. It was an incredibly fruitful time for baroque. So I was really lucky to find it in that time, I think. I
Yeah.
really do.
Yeah, because I
Brilliant.
remember, when all of those records came out, and now I just feel that things maybe are a little bit too clean and a little bit too clinical, and I feel like we kind of take that whole sound world, I think, for granted.
Well, it's funny you should say about clean because that's exactly how Red Priest really found its kind of form, because
Yeah, and let's go on
everything
to
got
that
rather
actually.
clean. Yeah, everything got rather clean in the 80s and 90s as well, certainly in the 90s as well. And I think it was because of all the recordings. There was this real pressure for everything to be so perfect that actually, the standard got higher and higher and higher. In the 1970s, there were all these wonderful eccentrics that were all playing, and they were so creative and free. and perhaps they hadn't quite mastered sometimes, the technicalities of the instruments and things. So, and they were perhaps a bit primitive with some of the things they did, like this idea of a messa di voce where you do a lovely bloom on a note. They
Yes.
took it and they ran with it to the point where the early music movement had a bit of a reputation for everybody kind of making these big bulges. So there are some things that got ironed out and refined in a good way, such as that, more of an understanding of a true messa di voce, and more of an understanding about the vibrato element, and the fact that of course you can use vibrato. It's just when you use vibrato and why you use vibrato and what speed, and whether you're aware that you're using vibrato, rather than, so there was this in the 70s, there was this rather an idea that you better switch off the vibrato that had been so incredibly there, in the decades before that. And everything had to have its phase of discovery. So there were a lot of things that were being discovered in a good way in the 80s and 90s, but then it became a bit too clinical, as you say. And I started to feel uncomfortable with that. And at that point, I met Piers Adams, recorder player, and he was feeling a bit the same. He was being rather kind of rebellious. And we just both, well, I discovered this amazing group in the 80s called Il Giardino Armonico, who are still very much around now. And they were just blowing it apart. They were absolutely fantastic. They were going right back to real, them, the real extreme dynamics. And
incredible.
And they were incredible. And I introduced that group to Piers, who hadn't heard them yet. And we both said, well, we want to be like that. That's what we want to be like. So they were our inspiration for starting Red Priest. And that's how it all began. We just said, right, we're just going to do what we want to do now. We want to just free all this up again,
Tell us a little bit more about how the group came about. Like you said, you were getting a little bit fed up with how the early music scene was, and you wanted to shake things up a bit.
Yeah, we did. So we deliberately did things that we knew people would find difficult. For example, we played at 440, pitch 440, instead of at 415, because 415 is just a modern day convenience.
Yes.
And it's just one of many pitches, but we know that Vivaldi played a lot at much higher. I mean, 440 near enough. Piers's favorite recorders were at 440, and we thought, well, why not 440? And actually it was great fun because the whole sound became a lot more taut, I guess, and bright. So we've all the way through, always played at 440. And we also made arrangements of things. So there were very few pieces that we played which were just simply for the exact format of harpsichord, cello, recorder and violin. We did arrangements of whatever we felt like, because again, we knew that was authentic, that people are always making arrangements out of things, or copying, or swapping instruments around or whatever. We knew that was authentic, and we just, but yeah, we made a few enemies along the way musically, though. There were people that felt it was like Marmite. People either loved it or hated it, really.
Yeah.
So we had to kind of ignore a lot of criticism as well.